The mules are in the corral. Welcome to Mule Talk, and I'm Cindy K. Roberts, your host.
And our very own,
our author, TV personality, and world-renowned mule trainer,
Meredith Hodges.
We're back. I read this article called Rock and Roll, Diary of a Rescue that Meredith Hodges wrote, and Meredith, it really touched my heart. This is an amazing story. So you're going to tell us everything about these animals and what you did for them.
I surely am, and I might start by saying I didn't plan on taking them on at all. I had 30 animals at the time, and they made 32.
Oh.
But I always welcome a challenge, and these guys were probably the worst-case scenario I had ever seen. I went to the National Western Stock Show in January of 2010 to see my friends, Fran and Larry Howe, and they showed me these two mules, and they were crammed in 12 by 12 stalls at the stock show, taking up every square inch of those stalls, I might add. Those mules were 17 and a half and 18 hands high.
Wow.
And Roll was 17 years old and Rock was 18 years old, and they were half brothers. But they were in really poor condition, and Fran told me at the time that they were going to see what they could do about rehabbing them and maybe hitching them up again if they could. She got back to me in December, and she said she tried everything. Rock had some abscesses in his mouth that made him really head shy, and she said they went in and removed the teeth. Didn't leave him with much teeth, and the teeth he did have weren't in very good shape anyway. She had him on dynamite feed. That was supposed to put weight on him, but it wasn't doing the trick. So she told me, she says, well, Meredith, if you don't take them, I have to send them to the slaughterhouse. And I said, well, I can go ahead and try. I'll do that. Now, I might say at this point, and I know that Fran meant well, as do a lot of people, when they rescue animals, they think in terms of, oh, well, I'll feed them differently than they were fed, and I'll make sure they're in clean pens, and I'll make sure I got a farrier that can trim them regularly so their feet don't grow out and stuff like that. Because most of these rescue animals do have feet that are foundered, they are overgrown, and a lot of them even have the toes curled up and all of that, and they're really drastic. Now, these guys' feet weren't curled up or anything, but Larry did the trimming. Now, I know Larry meant well, but I still stand by the fact that you cannot know what a real farrier who has gone to farrier school knows. He knows all the angles of all the bones in the body, and he can trim those feet to match those angles so that that animal can be put into good posture. Now, my farrier is like that. He's really very, very good. And he not only went to farrier school, but he also apprenticed with a corrective shoer. And this guy exposed him to all the different problems that you can have with these animals' feet. When abscesses appear, when they get white lined, when they get founder rings and the hoof is weak, and what you can do to support it, how you can maintain the bones inside the hoof so that the coffin bone doesn't get on the wrong angle and start coming through the sole. My farrier knows about all this stuff, and I was definitely going to have to talk to him first when they came in, because both of these mules, if you can imagine, they looked okay from a glance. If you looked at their bodies, you would have thought, oh, yeah, they're in good conformation pretty much, and they're a little straight-legged in the back legs and a little bit over in the knees and look a little hunched. But other than that, they look pretty good, and their feet are trimmed. They had some stress rings in there from founder on the feet. But when my farrier got in there, the first thing we did was take x-rays with the veterinarian, and we found out that the coffin bone was rotating. Now, you wouldn't have known that just to look at their conformation at a glance, but what was really happening was, I found out later after I put them in the elbow pull and started walking them through the hourglass pattern, that they were actually not walking properly at all. They were taking little steps behind, and they were out back when they were traveling, and they weren't going into drafts the right way. They were going into the drafts, pulling the wagons downhill. What happened when they did that was their pelvis got tilted. And when Roll started getting into better posture, then he started looking like he was camped out back, and that's what made me look at that pelvis a little more carefully, because he could not step underneath his torso to meet the center of gravity. I really paid attention to that, and I had to get his elbow pull a little bit tighter, and I had to move him at a more animated walk than he was really willing to give me when he was in that pattern. And I did the same thing with Rock, but I had to be really careful with Rock, because according to the CSU and the chiropractor, they thought he had a fracture on his pelvis. Little did we know until we did a necropsy a year later that the entire hip joint in the right hind leg was shattered. He really could not move that leg hardly at all, and what he was doing, compensating for it, was keeping it fairly stiff, lifting it from the hip and swinging it forward. So it kind of looked like it was coming forward toward the center of gravity, but it really wasn't. It was just kind of swinging randomly into whatever place it landed. And then he would lean on the post, is what I would liken it to, and then lift the other hind leg and go forward that way. I had to tighten up the elbow pull on Roll to get him to start reaching underneath and stretching his pelvis and getting it straightened out. And I had to hire the chiropractor to make sure that those bones were all in alignment. And when we did that, when you do chiropractic randomly, what happens is, it gets all the bones in alignment, sort of, but you can't get them into alignment if they spent 17, 18 years moving the wrong way. You're going to be stopped by any calcium deposits that are formed from them actually walking that way. This is what happened with both of them, because they were walking kind of wobbly. And I would liken it to, even though they were trimmed okay, they weren't trimmed in balance like a real knowledgeable farrier can do. And so you can kind of, even though they make table legs for tables exactly the same way for the table, if the top is warped, then the table legs are not going to be on the floor and stay there equally. They'll wobble. The table will wobble if it's warped through the tabletop. And if you think about these animals with all four legs, but the body is out of whack, then this is what's going to happen. They're going to get unequal weight over all four legs, and it's going to affect everything from the hoof up. And that's why they look camped out back, because I was looking at those bones and I thought, if those bones are what I think they are, then when I drop a plumb line from the back of the hip at the tail straight down, it should go straight down to the hock, straight down the cannon bone, hit the fetlock, and to the ground. And the hooves should line up with that. And yes, mules have more upright feet than horses do, okay. But they also have more upright angles in the bones, in the hip joint, in the fetlock joint, and all of that. And it looked like they should line up, but they weren't. And that's what gave me the clue that the pelvis had to be tipped forward. It just had to be. I wasn't about to go and take them in for an x-ray, because in order to do an x-ray, what they would have had to do, and I asked my veterinarian about it, he said what they will do is they will anesthetize them and turn them upside down to take those x-rays. And I thought, putting 2,500 pounds on joints like that up at the top is not going to do anything but make it worse. And so I thought, my program, my hunch was, and my thinking is that I was dealing with putting these equines into a good postural balance, ideal equine posture for each individual, regardless of conformation. That was my theory. And so I thought, well, if my theory really works, then these exercises that I'm going to do with them will do no harm. Even if they've got broken bones in there, it will move those bones around as best that you can. After 2 years of them being like this, Fran told me that they had been like this for 2 years and that they just got a hold of them in the second year, at the beginning of the second year. That's why they were headed for the slaughterhouse, is because the people that before her couldn't do anything with them at all. They were lame. They couldn't pull. They couldn't walk. So she tried them for another year, and I got them in December. I saw them in January, but I got them in December. And so I thought, well, I'm going to go ahead and put them into this hourglass pattern of mine. And if anybody is going to prove the validity of my entire program, it's going to be these two guys, because they had different problems, which meant that I had to look at them each differently. I'll back up a little bit here. So I thought, that Fran warned me they were cribbers. And so when we built the facility for them, we built it out of my mini pens behind the garage and just dug it down 4 feet so we could make the bigger stalls for the mules, the draft mules. Remember, 17 and a half and 18 hands tall. We made big stalls for them, 12 by 16. Their runs were 24 by 36 feet. And then we put steel everywhere. We used steel panels. We used steel plating on the walls. It was really kind of funny when we got them and we put them in there. First thing Roll wanted to do was chew on the fence. So he went over to that panel and just crunched it with his jaws, but it didn't go anywhere. And I was looking at him, and he was looking at me, and he kind of rolled his eyes, and he goes, "What's this?" I said, "Roll, that's a steel panel, and you're going to learn not to crib anymore. You're not going to chew on these things because you can't." And he got all frustrated, and then he just left his jaw there and just rested it on that panel for probably 5 or 10 minutes, before he finally decided it was useless. But
oh, how funny.
But that's how I break bad habits. Like I was telling you earlier before we started this conversation, I don't go after bad habits with gimmicks and devices. I go after them by creating a situation where that they can learn to be calm. And the first thing that I notice about animals that have vices is they are loaded with anxiety. So it's really important that you set up the situation so you don't create any anxiety by making any abrupt moves or by talking to them in a stern way or anything like that. You just talk to them in a nice, quiet, civil voice and try to explain things to them. And so I do. And I've had people tell me that I should treat mules like they were mules because they don't have feelings and they need to have a leader and they need to learn to respect the leader. And I'm sitting there thinking about it and I'm going, well, you say they don't have feelings, but you're trying to elicit respect from something that doesn't supposedly have any feelings.
Right.
Well, if you can't act towards those feelings and try to manipulate their feelings a little bit, how are you going to get anywhere with them? And it was pretty clear to me. When those guys came in, their eyes were really kind of closed. Their nostrils weren't flared or anything like that. They were kind of closed up, too. They had wrinkles around their nostrils from just, gee, I'm so done with this. They're talking to you.
Sure.
With all that body language that they have, they're talking to you.
Right.
And especially through their eyes. The eyes are the windows to the soul. When an animal has bright, happy eyes, you can tell they're happy. They're really happy. And when they come in and their eyes are half closed and they look kind of dead and they look just worn out, you know there's bad stuff going on in there. You know they're feeling pain. You know they're feeling frustration. You know they're feeling like they can't do anything about it, so I'll just give in. And you can see it in their faces. And so that's why I talk to them the way that I do, is because I know that if I acknowledge their feelings, that they will kind of start listening to me and give me their attention. And that's just part of the thing that I do. The other thing that I do is when they try to manifest these frustrations by going and developing vices like biting or kicking or any of those kinds of things, I nip those things in the bud. If they're a cribber, I don't put them in pens anymore that are wire fences or hot wires only. I line my vinyl fences with a hot wire to keep them off the fence. But if they do happen to get to the fence, they'll realize it's just like chomping down on a steel fence. It's just not as hard, and you can't chew it. So it's kind of a pointless effort. But I set up the situations so that I can be successful with them. I don't expect them to kick at me, but I take precautions. When I'm putting on the halter, for instance, I stay in close. And that's another thing, too. I know that rope halters have those knots in them. And however we think that that's okay to wear it because it's lightweight, those little knots can cause a constant source of pressure that can get really, really aggravating to an animal, really annoying. And all you have to do is put your index finger underneath your ear and let it sit there for a while to realize that it doesn't take a lot of pressure to begin to aggravate you. But if you put your whole palm under your ear and you feel that, it kind of feels like a caress. It's not intimidating. It's not aggravating. And that's the difference between those rope halters and the nylon web halters. The web halters can be made to fit, and they just lay on their face. And yeah, they can take off with you with those. But if they don't want to leave, if you don't give them a reason to leave, then they won't leave. They'll stick with you because you're not aggravating them. And so that's where it's really important to talk to them, to tell them what you're going to do. Oh, look at this. We're gonna go over here and we're gonna go through this pattern. And no, you don't need to be afraid of the cones. You don't need to shy from them. And you put your lead rope on, and then from experience, I've learned that if they can't get their head up in the air and invert their neck and their back, then they're less likely to take the lead rope and run away from you. So even though I'm just leading them through this hourglass pattern, I put them in full gear with the elbow pull so that it keeps their head from flipping too high. It's not that it keeps their head down. It keeps them from flipping their head so high that they can invert their neck, they can invert their back, and they can take whatever bit is in their mouth and just run with it. And with a halter, there's no bit, of course, so they can definitely do that. But they have to be in that position to bolt and run like that. So when I lead them through the hourglass pattern to keep them from bolting and running and going out of good posture, I just start with them in good posture by making them work in this elbow pull. And then throughout the pattern, there are places, for instance, when you're going between the corner cones and the center cones, where you stop and you set them up four square so they know what that feels like to be in good posture with equal weight over all 4 feet. And then you reward them and you wait for them to finish chewing up the oats, not carrots, not treats,
right,
or anything that's just something that can be chewed up really fast.
right.
Sitting there and chewing up the rolled oats or the crimped oats or whatever you're using, any kind of oats that are broken up, will give them the time to chew calmly while you stand still and show them that you will wait for them. So that eliminates any abrupt moves. They won't think that you're going to be in a hurry and all of a sudden you're going to interrupt everything by starting something else right away, which creates anxiety.
Right.
That's what those stops in the hourglass are all about. And then you will be changing directions on the arcs in that thing. That's why we don't go around the edge of the arena, because that arena makes their bodies, it gives it an optical illusion that causes them to lean away from the wall or lean away from the fence and lean towards the inside, which takes the weight off the outside legs and puts most of the weight on the inside legs. It's having an effect internally when they do that. That's why we want to do the hourglass pattern. So when you go around it and you stop between the corner cones and the center cones that are closer together in the middle, then when you start again, you let them eat their oats, and then you switch sides so that you're always leading from the inside of the next arc. And what that does is that causes you to shift your weight, but keep it over your 2 feet, and they keep equal weight over their 4 feet, no matter what direction you're doing. They've got an internal pendulum that will swing, and it will cause all of the elements that support the skeleton to be developed symmetrically at the deepest level. That means your ligaments, your tendons, your muscles. That means the soft tissues. That means the cartilage in the joints is going to be worn evenly and not asymmetrically when they're moving. So you're addressing all these little things inside that make a huge, huge difference in the way that they're moving. And so even though you don't think about it, if their bodies aren't in symmetrical motion when they're moving, and it isn't built that way, when they're chewing their food, their jaw can be upset, and it can be off-center, so they don't chew evenly. So their teeth wear abnormally. Then they get abscesses like what Rock had. And, a lot of people like to blame these things on the saddle or on this or on that, when most of the problems that these animals start to manifest and any lameness that can't be quickly identified is probably coming from deep, deep within, right there at the core, where it's supporting the skeletal frame. When they get sore backs, if they're carrying their head too high, which can happen when you don't put them in the elbow pull and you don't force them to walk in good equine posture, they raise their heads too high. And what that does is that puts more pressure on those spinous processes and drives them together and makes them rub and create calcification across the spine, which is called kissing spine. When you've got them in the elbow pull, it encourages them to stretch their back, their spine, from head to tail, and it pulls those processes apart. How do I know this? Because of the necropsy we did on Rock, who had calcium in the spine, kissing spine in several places, and some places after 18 years had really thick calcium between those processes. But there were a couple of places on his spinal processes where it hadn't really closed up all that much, but when I put him into the elbow pull, it actually broke it apart. So you could see the ridges of the calcium deposits where they used to be together, and now they're not, because the movement in the elbow pull broke it apart.
Wow.
Yeah, it's pretty drastic. And who's going to think about this when they're rescuing an animal, right?
Right.
Who's going to even think about these things? But I like to be very observant, and with these guys, I was forced to be extremely, extremely observant as to what was going on with them. And in the x-rays, it showed that Rock didn't have as bad. His side bones were taller than Roll's, and Rock only had side bones in the front feet, but Roll had them in the 2 front feet and 1 behind. And if you're thinking about a wobbly table, there you go again. All those joints up and down are being wobbled. So when the veterinarian came and took all the x-rays, when we got done with the x-rays, he had his laptop with him, so we usually previewed the x-rays right away to see what we could observe right away, so we would know what course of action to take with the animal in the following week. One of the things that the mules really enjoyed was when we took the x-rays and we were looking at them, We brought the mules over so they could see the monitor too. And you know what? You should have seen their ears. They were looking at it. Their ears were flopping back and forth. We were talking about what we were seeing on the screen. We were pointing at it and everything. And I swear to God, those mules acted like they knew every word we said. They really are very intelligent animals.
Yeah, they are. Awesome.
And they weren't turning away. They weren't fiddling around or anything like that. They were looking square at the screen. Ears perked. If somebody said something, they would flip an ear to them. It was very directed and creating all this calcification that's taking place in their legs. And it's not entirely visible, and you probably couldn't even tell if you didn't do x-rays or if you didn't feel down in there wherever you could, right there at the cornet band, and start feeling the abnormalities that were going on in those legs. You know, because as far as they were concerned, they were walking fine, you know, and they looked like they were, except for the obvious swinging of the hip that Rock was doing. And actually, Roll looked kind of okay through the hourglass pattern, and that's why I graduated him to the round pen, because he looked like he was doing okay, so maybe he could move to trot. And so I put him in the round pen, and then I saw what was going on behind. That really opened my eyes, because he was actually twisting his back feet as he was trotting. He would reach up underneath a little bit where Rock couldn't reach underneath at all. When those feet pushed off from behind, you could see him rotating. They would squish in the sand before they got up off the ground. And I thought, well, back to the hourglass pattern and the lead rope again. And then I noticed, too, that I had to figure out a way for both of them to learn to bend their joints properly and reach underneath the torso. And that really, I thought about that for several weeks before I finally came up with a solution to that. And I didn't have the ground rails between the two cones in the middle that were closer together before that. I just took them around the hourglass pattern with no rails, because I thought, well, they're so bad they can't step over rails the right way anyway. But then I started thinking, those ground rails that I usually use are 4 inches wide. And yeah, they got to step up to get over them. And if I was going to use those, then it probably wouldn't work. They just clunk through them and hit them every time they went through. They wouldn't necessarily learn to bend their joints and step up and over them unless I started with 1-inch PVC pipes instead of 4-inch ground rails. And I started with 2 and worked my way up to 4 1-inch PVC rails. And once they could get over the 1-inch PVC rails without hitting them, then I knew I could add another rail. And I would add another rail until I got up to 4. When they got to the point where they could go over the 4 1-inch PVC rails, okay, and they were lifting and bending their joints enough to get over that, then I increased the first rail to 2-inch and kept the other 3 1-inch. Then after a week or 2, then I increased the second rail to 2-inch and then left the other 2 1-inch rails. And I worked it up to 4 2-inch rails. I did the same thing with 3-inch PVC. And then pretty soon, they were going over my 4-inch rails. But it took a couple months for me to get them to really bend those joints and step the right way. And you can tell it was hard for them, because when they're in the elbow pull, when the elbow pull is tight, that means that they're having trouble sustaining that balance, because all those internal muscles and elements in there are striving to stay symmetrical down at the skeleton level. And so it creates soreness. It most definitely does.
Oh, yeah.
And so I started out at first, and I was doing them every other day because I thought, well, they have to do this. But then I had 30 other animals I had to, do training with that had all graduated to the round pen. They had been doing their hourglass on lead rope for a long time, and they all got to graduate to the round pen. And so I kind of bided my time by doing group lessons. This was when I discovered that group lessons were very beneficial because I didn't have time with those 2 draft mules to handle all these other mules too, unless I threw them all on the pen together and lunged them together. And that worked fine. Everybody had to get their own surcingle, so I had my saddle maker make me surcingles for 12 mules. And then I made 12 elbow pulls, and they all had their own bridles. So that made that possible, and it greatly shortened my time on exercising them, which gave me more time with the draft mules. But I noticed that they were getting a little bit sore, and I was running out of time to get everything done.
Yeah.
So I wondered if I just did these draft mules once a week in this hourglass pattern, if it would affect their bodies differently than it did when I was developing boat muscle. And it did. The core muscle stays longer. And it's because the body is fighting to find that ideal posture again when they're at rest. And those 2 draft mules were such a mess. They rested a lot. Now, Rock couldn't even lay down because he couldn't get up. And so for 2 months, that mule, we just did massage on him, went ahead and walked him through the hourglass pattern and tried to gain strength that way in good posture. He was improving. And the other thing that I did, too, I noticed that when I was using my vacuum cleaner, which I used to get them clean, because we were in the winter. We were in December, January, February, and I couldn't give them a bath.
Right.
But what I could do is rough up the coats and everything and get most of the dirt out of there by using my equine vacuum cleaner. But I noticed that when I took the vacuum cleaner over his rump and across his rump towards his tail, he would raise his tail. And I thought, oh, well, that's kind of when you're scratching their butt. They like that. But what does it...
All right.
What does it do to the body that creates that kind of a reaction? I determined that it creates more blood flow through the capillaries and into the muscle tissue, which creates more of a sensation on the level of the skin so that they can feel it better. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah.
So it does. It increases the feelings that they have across their whole body when you vacuum them like that. It brings all those capillaries up and irrigates all that muscle tissue and creates higher sensitivity and promotes growth in all the tissues and everything that are involved in the body. And it gets them all healthier because they're all being irrigated by the oxygenated blood. And that was another new thing that I discovered. And my veterinarian, every time he came to do x-rays, he was, "What are you doing?" He says, he comes back and all of a sudden the coffin bone isn't on that angle anymore and it's not going down. But what we were doing, we got them into the good posture slowly. They had to fight those tilted pelvis to get their legs in the right position and all of that. But by moving the whole leg all the way from the hip to the bottom, made that pelvis start going backwards to where it was supposed to be and created less of a flat level on it, which brought their legs under their bodies. And with the poles that they were going over in the hourglass pattern, they were learning to move all those joints, to flex those joints all the way down, the hip, the hock, the fetlock, and even right there at the coronet band and moving that, because that was stiff too. They were straight from the fetlock down to the toe. And they didn't roll their feet when they were walking. They didn't land on the heel and roll to the toe. And all these little things that I discovered along the way and fixed the situations so that they could move that way. And really, there is a thing called range of motion that you can affect during massage, that you can do stretches, passive stretches with them. But that was like out of the question with Rock. You couldn't touch that hindquarters at all because it would rock the weight onto that broken hip, and he couldn't tolerate that.
Right.
So I opted not to do any passive stretching exercises at all, except to turn their heads to the side, to have them lower their heads to the floor and do stretches that way, but I never touched their hindquarters because I didn't know what kind of damage it would do to do something like that. But that's why I use those ground rails, because that way they're getting the passive stretch from going over the ground rails, but they're manipulating those stretches themselves. And they're only taking those joints and bending those joints as far as they can at any given time. And I could watch what was going on by looking at the elbow pull. Because in the beginning, when they were even just standing still, and I would get their feet lined up, they would raise their head so that elbow pull was really tight between the bit and their forearms, and right between their legs. They would hold it tight because they were leaning on the part that went across the pole, because they couldn't hold that posture on their own. That's what told me their cores were trashed.
Oh, yeah.
Just trashed. After working over these poles and stuff for a few months, then the other thing that I would observe, too, is that they would not step in the middle between the poles. They would step a little in front of the pole, a little after the pole, which made them have to take a bigger step to get over the next pole, and there were all kinds of things going like that, and it kept the elbow pull really tight. You know, I just observed all this, but what I saw after a few months is that pretty soon they were stepping directly in the middle between those poles, and the elbow pull was staying loose as they went over the poles. There would be a few times when they raised their head and get tight for a second, and then it would go loose again. So they were going in and out of it, in and out of it, in and out of it. But I could see progress. It was really happening. The other thing is in the beginning, their behavior, Rock was so miserable that he didn't really move for anything, except if you went to put on his halter, he would raise his head and try to take it away from the halter. He just didn't want you to mess with him. But he was very passive about it. Roll, on the other hand, was such a freak. He was like snorty, and I'm gonna pound you if you come anywhere near me, And I asked Larry, I said, Larry, have you ever tried to ride either one of these guys? And Larry says, yeah, I sat on Rock. And that's right, sit on the one with a really sore hip. Okay, yeah, I get why you did that, because you knew he wasn't going anywhere. I remember when I told you about people that told me to try to wear the animal out in the round pen before I mount them, and all they did was get stronger? Well, Rock looked like a lot less trouble than Roll did, but he was the one that everybody felt sorry for, too. And my massage therapist came over religiously once a week, and the chiropractor came over about every other week. But she felt really sorry for Rock, so she'd give him really long massages. And I asked her, I said, so are you going to do Roll? And she goes, no, she says, these guys are so big that doing Rock, it just really wears me out. And I said, well, then teach me how to do it, and I'll do Roll. We did that. We brought them both in, and she told me how to do it, and I learned how to massage these guys the right way. So in the beginning, they were so big that even a step stool wasn't going to help, and you had to keep moving it up and down their bodies and getting off, getting on, starting here, starting there, and it was a little erratic. A massage is supposed to be relaxing and smooth. We decided that it might be better if we could just do their backs by getting up on them and sitting on them and starting up behind the pole and down the neck and sitting behind the withers. And then once we got down behind the withers, then we would do the part that was underneath us. Then we would turn around on them and continue down the back and over the rump to the tail. As long as we were massaging, they thought that was great. And they stood absolutely still for that.
I guess so.
You know? Yeah, and who would have thought? But it was out of necessity because they were kind of moving around when we were doing it from the step stool and everything. And once we got the backs, then we could move down the shoulders and the hips and down the legs and in the front, you know, and around the head and all that. Because we could move those parts, and they were all low. So we just started by getting on their backs, which worked out just fine. And little Mr. Busy Roll and Snorty Roll, he got really cute. My other massage therapist and her husband were working on Rock. I was over there working on Roll, but we kind of fooled around a little bit, and he tried to kick me a couple of times. No, if you do that, I'm going to stop, and I'm not going to do this nicely anymore. I'll just walk away. You don't have to be done. And I'd start to walk away, and then he'd turn around and he'd look at me, and I go, "What's the matter, Poe?" I used to call him Poe. And he'd go, "Oh, will you come on back?" So I'd come back, and I'd give him some notes, and I'd go, "Okay, now you're going to stand still, right?" "Oh, yeah." So he would. I kind of got up and around his head, and he was really snorty around his head, too. And I thought, well, I'm putting this towel on his neck because I started out by doing him with my hands only, but then with those big bodies, we decided getting some of those thumpers might be a good idea, a human massager. And so we got a couple of those and decided to see how they would tolerate those. They liked it. We just used them across where we had our hands. We didn't go random or anything like that. Kept the whole routine just like it was before and got up right behind their ears while we were on their back. So they got that thing pretty close to the ears on their heads and everything. We just do their faces and everything with the hands. That was fine. We put a towel over them every time we were using that because we didn't want those thumpers to get dust inside of them or anything from their coats. And I thought one day when I was with Roll, I thought, well, Roll and I have been kind of fooling around here, so I had the towel around his neck, and he was really goofy with his head, and I got out in front of him, and I grabbed the towel on both sides, and I go, "Roll, we're going to play peekaboo towel." And he says, "What?" And I started moving that towel up the back of his ears and down his forehead. And he was looking at me, and I brought it part way, and I said, "What do you think?" And his eyes got kind of white, big and white. And so I reached in my fanny pack, and I gave him some oats, and I said, "Peekaboo pow!" And I moved it down a little bit further. He was like, "Oh, well, this isn't bad, I guess." Moved it all the way down his nose. Now he can't see anything. I've got this bath towel over his whole head, and I'm slipping the oats underneath and everything. And then I just finally pulled it all the way down his face and shook it in front of his face, and he just went, "Oh, the fanny pack, it's open." And he dives into the fanny pack. And I said, "Oh, okay, well, here, go right ahead. Help yourself." And I just kept talking to him, and I said, "Okay, that's enough," and I zipped it up. And then he's sitting there chewing. Several times, many times afterwards, I just play peekaboo-po with him. And meanwhile, we were introducing Rock to umbrellas because he was kind of spooky around his head, too. And what we would do is we would slowly open the umbrella in front of him, give him oats as we were doing it, as he stood still. If he moved, we just took a step back. And then when he was calm again, then we'd take another step forward. So we were introducing spooky things to them while they were just standing still in the tack barn during their massages. So we kind of integrated all this good stuff with the stuff that would ordinarily set them off. Just integrating all this stuff with no pressure really had a dramatic effect on their attitudes, on their bodies. It was just amazing what we were able to accomplish. And I did figure out that I could just do the hourglass pattern once a week, and their core kept getting stronger. We did the massage once a week. We did chiropractics every other week. And then once a month, we would have veterinarian come and take x-rays. And this was another opportunity to engage them and to introduce them to more talk, because my veterinarian had a mobile x-ray unit. And so after we took the x-rays, we could actually see the x-rays on his laptop. Now, Rock was a real challenge. This is another thing that you kind of take things for granted, but in order to do an x-ray, you have to have the foot up off the ground to get the whole hoof. The vet had some 2-inch high blocks that he would put their feet on to lift them up, and we'd do the front feet first, the back feet next, and you'd have to put both feet up in the front and both feet up on the back to keep the balance while you're doing it. And then, of course, we had these x-ray frames that we had to shove between their legs and down by the fetlock joints in the hoof and everything, and rotate them around the leg to get all the angles. And that could be aggravating for them, especially if they're trying to hold a position on a block that was only 6 by 6 by 2 inches off the ground. Front feet went okay, but when we got to the back feet, Rock could not stand. He could not lift his leg high enough to put it on that 2-inch high block. And so we had to kind of make up our own way of doing it. So Chad went out and got a couple of 2x4s, and we cut them and put them on the ground. Just use those 2x4s underneath his back feet. And so he only had to lift his feet 2 inches off the ground. That worked pretty well. He was willing to do that. And I might mention at this point, too, that the farrier, when we were doing them in the beginning, they were both barefoot until we realized that they were wearing their feet irregularly. They were trimmed irregularly. We were trying to get it straightened out. And in order to keep control of the shape of the foot, we were forced to put shoes on them. So we went ahead and put shoes on all 4 feet on roll, no problem. But Rock had so many nail holes on the front feet that we didn't think that we could put shoes on him without causing cracks in his hooves. So we didn't put any shoes on the front on Rock right away. We put shoes on his back feet. We got those on there, and when we put those on, then the feet stopped wearing irregularly, and we were more able to keep his feet symmetrical and start working towards the ideal balance. After we got the back feet squared away with the shoes, then the front feet started cracking. And so we had to put something there. So we had a pair of custom-made boots put on for him. I ordered them. I gave him the measurements. We took pictures. We took x-rays and sent them to the boot maker. And we got boots that actually fit his feet. And the vet and the farrier and I talked about this. And, of course, they had rubber booties out there for everybody that people were using, and they're a big thing to go trail riding in right now. But if you think about this from a balancing and a postural level, you would realize that, number one, they can't make those things well enough to fit every animal's feet, even going small, medium, large,
right,
without having it shift their feet inside the boots.
Mm-hmm.
And if they're shifting their feet in their boots, they're shifting their weight all the way up their leg and into their body.
Yeah.
Which is going to eventually cause soreness and things out of whack in their body. That's why we opted to go ahead and have custom boots made for him that would not move as much. They're still going to move, and we watched them do it. And we watched him when he walked, and they stuck with his feet pretty well, but I would never substitute them for shoes. And people will tell you that, oh, they don't want putting nail holes in the hoofs and stuff. But if you think about that, they've been, farriers have been around for centuries, and they are the professionals, and they know exactly where to drive a nail. Now, it's the ones that don't that cause the problems.
Right.
It's the ones that drive those nails in the wrong places. A good farrier is not going to get those nail holes very high up on the foot. So if you wait your 6 to 8 weeks between trims, those holes are going to be almost grown out. And when he takes the nippers to the hooves, they're not going to be anywhere near the new nail holes that are going to be put in. And your hooves are not going to be at risk of cracking because they've got a shoe on them to prevent that. And they're held in place, and they stay in place. And the shoe keeps the foot in balance. If I could have put shoes on Rock's front feet, I would have. But those nail holes were all the way up and down his front feet, and there was no way to hit a spot where it wouldn't compromise the hoof. And that's why we used the boots. I would never use them for riding because they do affect their balance. And they were going to give them compromises through their whole body if you use those on all 4 feet just to go trail riding and you think you're protecting the feet, but they're still getting worn inside the boots. The boots typically have rough spots on the bottoms of them to give them traction so they're not slippery on the bottom inside. So those are still wearing the feet. The other thing that's happening is the frog is not able to hit the ground and pump the blood through the foot the way that it's supposed to, the way it's designed to. If you do heavy trail riding or showing or anything like that, and you try to go with a barefoot trim, it's going to crack their feet from the wear. So you really do need proper shoes on your animal according to the individual and according to use. And that's why I say, each individual has to be assessed as an individual. Their individual needs for their physical development, their individual needs for their mental development, and they need exposure to all the things that will help to calm them down and help them to stay that way. Talking to them about everything. You may think it's pointless to say, oh, we're going to go over these poles now. They get to learn the language. And I've come to the conclusion that these guys are a lot smarter than we give them credit for, and especially mules. Horses could care less. Horses are, you're going to use me? I know you're going to use me. I'll do what you want if you force me enough.
Right.
Mules are, mules are out there for self-preservation, and they like to do things that are sensible. They have a reason to be done. Why go over a bridge when you can go around it?
Right.
And I just say, because it's fun. Oh, really? They say, oh, really? And they start backing up.
Right.
And I go, oh, no, but think about this. When we go over the bridge for the silly reason that I have, then you get to eat the oats, which is your silly reason for doing it. So we kind of negotiate, and we have these conversations, and I swear to God, these other trainers think I'm crazy. But that's okay. I've taken my mules out and done things with my mules that nobody's ever done. And I've done it because of the approach that I have and the way I do it, and the fact that I'm willing to take as much time as it takes, because my mules also taught me ultimate patience. I don't fight with them at all. If they don't want to do something, I know they got a good reason for it, and we have discussions about it. And so, I mean, when you're talking to your mules this way, not only caring about their physical development and all of that, and then doing things in little tiny steps that may take a long time. I think of it in terms of gaining ability, gaining athletic performance, and gaining a really intimate bonding with the animal that's just like gaining a friendship with another human being if you are willing to put the time in to do it. It yields the same kinds of amazing result when you do that kind of thing. I found the shortcuts in this program. It was like, I don't have to spend every other day drilling, that those core muscles were going to stick. And not only that, I let them sit over the winter because I have an indoor arena and everything, and I was able to get out there sometimes, but not even once a week for a while. But I did find that those core muscles stuck longer than bulk muscle does.
Yeah.
Wow. When I did start back, they weren't too far out of whack from where they had been. And I kind of got that idea anyway because I knew that when I didn't ride my horses all winter that I was going to be in for bucking in the spring. Uh-oh. But the mules never did that. The mules never bucked. They were right where I left them.
Mm-hmm.
And they always are. They always will be. At one point, you're paying attention to all this stuff, too. One of the things that alerted me to I better put some boots on the front of Rock was that he was getting really sore on the front end, and when we x-rayed him, that coffin bone was going through the sole because the sole was getting thin. So what we had to do was we had to make it so that the sole would be able to grow and not be worn down. And that's why we did the boots the way that we did. I forget exactly how long it was. It wasn't too terribly long, but it was probably about 3 weeks. And his sole had grown 3/8 of an inch in the 3 weeks. And he was able to walk properly on those front legs again. And that coffin bone was also less of a straight down angle than it was when we x-rayed him before. You see those kinds of things. One of the things that I saw in their faces, for instance, too, when they came in, was Rock had a worried look over his eyes, and his eyes were kind of squinty. And Roll's eyes were kind of half closed and dull, and like I said before, their nostrils were pretty narrow and wrinkles in their nose, and that's their body language to let you know how uncomfortable they are.
Yeah.
And if you notice the pictures that I gave you with the article, and I'm going to follow up our interview with the articles too, so that people will be able to see the pictures of how they changed and how their faces, especially, the eyes became more open and bright. Their nostrils became more flared. They were taking in more oxygen and breathing not so shallow anymore. The wrinkles around the nostrils were completely gone. The musculature changes in their bodies was unbelievable. And I attribute a lot of that just to our feeding program, to what we do. I feed all my animals the same way with the grass hay, the Shogo vitamins, the Mazola corn oil in a minimized amount of oats fed once a day, not gallons. These things tend to, with the hourglass pattern exercises, and not done all that much, tends to change the shapes of their bodies. And you'll be able to see that in the pictures from when they first came in to 6 months later. Their coats went from dull to shiny. The musculature shifted throughout their body, so now it was in the appropriate places and not in just fat rolls placed here, there, and everywhere. That's another way you can tell if an animal has good core strength and is traveling properly, because his whole body really needs to reflect all of those things that he's using. And you get the lumps all over the body when they're not using that area. That's where the fatty tissue builds up. You know that from exercising yourself.
Right.
If you don't have exercises, you're going to have flab there. You know, if you don't do twists around your waistline, you're going to get that god-awful spare tire that as you age gets worse and harder to get rid of. All these things become apparent. So it's really kind of interesting, too, that I decided that a good way to evaluate a lot of these things was to try to put myself in their shoes and think about how they might be feeling. And I know that's projection from being a human, But are they really so different from us? I have to ask myself that too, because when I do that, I get the right responses from them. When I think, well, how would I feel if I had somebody abruptly turning me? Would that promote anxiousness in me? Would that promote anxiety? Yes, it probably would, because I wouldn't know when they were going to do it.
Right.
You know, I kind of approached it with that, and that's how I come up with this whole thing about talking to them, thinking about their bodies, thinking about what's happening here, what's happening there, when I do this, when I do that, and then talking to my professionals, my farrier, my veterinarian, and even at some points we had to pull the farrier and the veterinarian together all at the same time. One time we had to employ 2 chiropractors, one from CSU that we interviewed for the documentary about rock and roll. That's why we did that documentary with those farriers, with the farrier, with the chiropractors, I should say, 2 chiropractors, the farrier, the veterinarian, and one of the chiropractors was also a veterinarian. And we brought them in. There was another veterinarian that came with the masseuse, and we had a meeting in November when Rock started going south and got a really bad case of laminitis. So we brought the whole team together to talk about it and assess what was going on. And it's really important that you do leave yourself open to other people's opinions and another set of eyes to bring in all the different angles that what might be going on so that you can come to a viable solution. Now, when he had that laminitis, for instance, the veterinarian said, well, you're going to have to soak Rock, all 4 feet, in buckets, 5-gallon buckets, 3 times a day in ice water.
Ooh.
And I said, what? I said, I can't do that. He goes, why not? And I said, because it's hard enough to get an equine to stick their foot in 1 bucket.
Yeah.
2 buckets is a stretch, but 4 when he can't even get the left hind foot off the ground? How am I going to get it into a 5-gallon bucket? He goes, oh, good point. Well, my ranch manager jumped in at that point, and he goes, no problem, Meredith. We got it covered. And he and his dad took out the backhoe, dug a hole in the ground with a ramp going in and a ramp going out. We lined it with waterproof rubber, and we put pea gravel on the bottom of it for traction so that Rock could walk right into it and right out of it. We could fill it up with water. It would hold the water. And then we bought an industrial ice maker. And we...
All right.
And when we filled it up with the water, we put the ice in it, and we had plenty of ice to get in there for each day. And it would make more ice overnight, you know. And so that was good. One of the things that Rock had a problem with, too, was after 2 months of his massage and the vacuum therapy and the hourglass treatment, he was actually able to start laying down and getting back up because he had enough strength in his body to be able to do it. But even more than that, it was the way he was doing it. He got up with equal weight over the 2 front feet and the 2 back feet, and he was able to hoist himself up that way. You know, you could tell after 3 months that was just one of those great, big, huge victories that took place. And then because he could rest, because he could lay down, he could get up again. When he was in turnout, he no longer stood in the corner and watched Roll play with the bunnies. He actually hobbled along after Roll, which meant he was moving around more. And the more he moved around, the more I noticed that he was moving closer to good posture every time, until it got to a point where he wasn't lifting and swinging that hind leg anymore. After the work over the ground rails, he was actually picking it up, bending his joints, and walking normally. You couldn't see that there was anything wrong with that hind leg after probably 6 months. And he was picking it up, putting it down the right way, and he wouldn't show that lameness until you asked him to trot, and then he'd start swinging the leg again because he couldn't. He couldn't really trot and put that much weight on it, bending all those joints and everything. He came out of that just fine. At one point, he got a sarcoid on his withers that had to be removed. He stood still for that. There was no way that he could have stood still for that surgery before.
Right.
Because he was uncomfortable. He had to shift his weight all the time.
Sure.
All the time, all the time.
Wow.
But these are all those little things that you don't think about when you're thinking about rescuing an animal. These animals go to the slaughterhouse for a reason. It's because somebody could not figure out what was going on with them, much less figure out a way of treatment for them. It's really difficult to figure that out. I have to tell you, when we had that whole team together to assess Rock, when he had that laminitis, at one point the vet/chiropractor from CSU got behind Rock and said, I want to look at his back because I bet that is really crooked. And so we got him a ladder, and he climbed up the ladder and he looked across the back and he goes, Meredith, how did you do this? I said, what? He says, this back is straight all the way from the withers to his tail and right up his neck. He says, all the way from ears to tail, he's straight. How did you do that? And I told him about my postural exercises, and he goes, that is really phenomenal. I have never seen this. That was the moment when I knew for absolutely sure that my approach to postural training is the way to go if you really want to prep your athlete, your equine athlete, to be able to do anything you want to do with him. This is not a way to necessarily just train him. This is a way to get his body prepared so that he will be able to do anything that you ask him to do, because any resistance that you get from an equine is 100% honest, because they are 100% honest in their reactions to whatever you are doing. I felt so confident about all this that we decided that this would be an amazing teaching device. And the day that we had to decide to put Rock down, he had been off of his hourglass exercises for a while because of the laminitis. He couldn't even hardly walk, much less through the pattern. I went ahead and decided to go ahead and just try once around and see how he did with that. As I was doing that pattern, he was going over the rails, and he lifted that hind leg, and then as he stepped forward and put weight on it, all of a sudden he lurched. And I looked back, and when he picked it back up, that femur had slipped out of the socket joint and was just hanging there. And that's when I knew, well, we can't do any more. That ligament that was holding that femur in the socket joint had let loose. Yeah. Now, I might mention at this point, and I know there's a lot of people out there that think that drugs are the answer to everything. I don't think that's necessarily true. That ligament was holding together just fine until he had a bout with laminitis, and he was having so much trouble walking that somebody suggested that we put Cosequin into his feed to lubricate that joint more. And it wasn't very long after that ligament let loose. And my take on that is that ligament was in there with the designed amount of fluid in the joint capsule to allow that ligament to stay healthy when everything else in that joint was torn. And I didn't know that it was torn in that joint until after we did the necropsy, after we put him down. But everything was. All the ligaments, all the tendons, all the meat, the muscle, everything was torn in there. And the only thing that was holding that joint together was that one ligament that went right into the socket, and all the musculature that we had built around that entire hip joint. The only thing that was healthy was muscle and the ligament. My take on that would be maybe too much fluid in that joint just compromised the tension in the ligament and caused it to break.
Oh, wow.
Now, that's just my assessment. That's my opinion. Can't prove it in any way, shape, or form. But I immediately thought, I'm not using Cosequin for anything anymore because, yeah, it will make them swing those joints, but how long is it going to last before that one ligament that holds those femurs in the socket joint lets loose like it did with Rock? And would Rock have gone longer had I not done that?
Right. Interesting.
I have to ask myself those questions.
Sure.
But I thought, with everything that I learned with these two draft mules, I thought we need to save his bones and find out what was really wrong through his whole body. I didn't do it with both of them because I didn't have room to cover everything, but I have the story on the wall that tells the story mostly about Rock the way we have done today, but also included Roll. It took a while to get the skeleton done, but we went ahead and did that, and then we put it on display here at the ranch, and we've got brass arrows to each of the points where there were things that were wrong with him, things we hadn't even discovered, calcification and stifle joint, for instance. We found the kissing spine and what had happened with the elbow pull and where it was so fused together that there was no way it was coming apart. And that was from pulling out of good posture. Pulling from sticking the legs out the backside and pushing forward downhill into the draft position instead of stepping well under with their back legs and pushing up into draft, into the collars, which is how they should have been traveling. They spent, God knows, their 17, 18 years pulling the wrong way. Well, probably less than that because they probably weren't started till they were 3 or 4. But that just goes to show that somebody's going to stay in that bad posture, and as they do that, there are things that are going to disintegrate, and they're going to take them down. I can't stress enough how important it is to stop thinking about going riding, stop thinking about driving, and start thinking about your equine athlete and developing his body to be able to do what you're asking to do by paying attention to those core exercises that will develop symmetrically all those elements around the spine and around the bones that are below so that he can perform without hurting himself. Then maybe we can reduce the number of animals that are going to the slaughterhouse. It's all in our hands. We are the humans, we are the keepers of these animals, and we are the ones that are expected to take care of them. I started out my career and I couldn't afford to get a riding instructor. So what I used to do was I used to take photographs, have my husband take photographs, and my daughter, and we'd switch back and forth and everything, take photographs and video of each other, and then sit there and watch it at night and assess what we were doing wrong. And then we would go back out and then we could fix it. Well, when I was doing Rock and Roll, I decided to keep a diary on them. And I have kept diaries on these animals ever since. And I've made articles that have shown up in the magazines from the things that I found out about keeping these diaries, because it's easy to forget the little things that you do along the way. You can remember the big things, but the little things that happen along the way are the things that you go back and you read these diaries if you've kept them, and you can see it in the pictures, you can see it in the videos, and then you read about it. When you write it, you have to write it right after your lesson, right afterward, so you don't forget anything. If you wait and go, oh, well, I'll write it tomorrow, you're going to forget something. So I taught myself to write these diaries after every single lesson that I did, including the riding lessons that I finally did get a dressage instructor. Then I went ahead and I would come home and I would write down everything she told me. And then I'd write an article about it. And that's how I got started in 1982. I got the instructor in 1986 and started writing the diary in 86. But I had photographs and video up to that point. So I knew what I had learned there. It was so shallow. I was only, learning a little bit, as much as I knew, until I got the instructor. And then I started getting all kinds of detail. And the same thing happened when I got Rock and Roll. I was going to feed them, take care of their feet, a little bit of exercise. didn't exactly happen that way.
Right.
I found myself, learning something new every single day with those guys. And it was a good thing that I wrote it all down, too, because then I was able to write these 2-part articles that I am using today. But then the really cool thing about the whole thing is that then when I wrote the articles, they got into the magazines, but then later I was able to do a video documentary about them, Rock and Roll, Diary of a Rescue, which we offer on video on demand, or you can buy the video itself in HD or DVD, and it tells the whole story, and it is the validation of my entire program. It tells you exactly why it works, and it's got all these details in it. Now, we've talked about both rock and roll today, but what I'd like to do is to go forward, and we'll do a part 2 next week, where we tell Roll's story, because most of the problems that we talked about today were Rock, because he was the worse off. But that's by no means to say that Roll was completely healthy, because he wasn't. And what the college told me on their assessment at the necropsy, they said that the team had to have been hit by something as big as a dump truck to do the kind of damage on those 2 animals that it did. And they were a team always. So everything that I did in the lessons, I did with them together. So next week, we're going to go ahead and talk about all the different things that went on with Roll, focus on Roll, and how I used all the things that I learned from both of them to help Roll to get better. And Rock only lasted a year, but Roll lasted 8 more years, and I was actually able to ride him through those 8 years.
That's incredible. Wow. And what's really good about our conversation here on Mule Talk is we're saving the world by one mule at a time.
Right.
That's what I love about it.
Exactly.
I mean,
I love that about what we're doing, too. And all we're doing is sharing the things that we've learned. The biggest thing is just being cognizant to the fact that we need to learn to be better listeners and really better observers of our equines so that we can learn.
This is incredible. So I guess it's lunchtime.
I guess it is. Are you hungry yet?
Oh, yeah. I can't really snack in the studio or you'll hear me eating.
Oh, I know. No, this is we gotta fly by the seat of our pants, and then we can go do our luxurious thing.
All right, Mare. Happy trails to you, and we'll talk later.
Sounds good. Right back at you.
You can get in touch with Meredith Hodges at thelucky3ranch.com. Call her at 970-663-0066.
Gotta go. My mule is looking for me.
Mule Talk is an Every Cowgirl's Dream production.